Who will Putin's successor be? Who might lead Russia after Putin, and how might Russian politics change, depending on who wins the struggle for succession? In this video, we'll talk about some contenders for the Russian throne. The recent military coup in Russia has led some experts to suggest that Putin may not run for the next presidential term and instead propose a successor. This is currently just speculation, but the discussion about Putin's successor is relevant in any case, as sooner or later Putin's regime will come to an end. But first of all, I should explain why talking about who might come after Putin is so popular in Russia. In democratic countries, people have the ability to choose a new leader through fair elections, but Russian political culture is very different. Deep down, many Russians are convinced that whoever leads the country won't be chosen by the people, but instead elevated by some hidden political power behind the scenes. I think things are this way because Russia has almost no experience of free democratic elections. After hundreds of years under the Tsars, Russia was ruled by the Soviets, whose leaders were chosen by the Communist Party. Ordinary people had no influence on the process. There was a very short period of relatively honest democracy from 1989 to 1996, but in 1996, President Boris Yeltsin, who was very unpopular at the time, made a backroom deal with Russian oligarchs so they support his re-election. In 1999, he resigned after appointing a prime minister who became almost officially known as his successor. It was Vladimir Putin. Putin was appointed prime minister, got very favorable coverage on Russian TV and swiftly got high approval ratings while being boosted by the Kremlin, the Federal Security Service or FSB, and the oligarchs. After Yeltsin's unexpected resignation, Putin easily won the 2000 presidential election. Russian journalists had a term for the whole arrangement: Operation Successor. This term captured the essence of what happened: not a democratic choice, but a secret plan concocted by the security apparatus and political operatives within the executive branch. After that, the idea of succession became a definitive feature of Russian political culture. Since 2004, the Russian media has made a cottage industry of publishing articles trying to guess who Putin's successor will be. In 2008, Putin repeated Yeltsin's operation, appointing his pet politician Dmitry Medvedev to the presidency. But unlike Boris Yeltsin, he didn't resign. Instead, he returned to the Kremlin 4 years later. Now, 70 years old, Putin is relatively old for a president, and he's bogged down in a brutal and senseless war that he unleashed through his own stupidity. In 2024 there will be another presidential election in Russia, formally at least, and although Putin has changed the constitution so that he can now be re-elected for a 5th presidential term, people are once again speculating about who might succeed him in the Kremlin. But it's not only the upcoming presidential election that makes this topic relevant to today. The second reason is the war itself. The war has turned out to have much more drastic and severe consequences than Putin expected, and this has destabilized the once predictable political system. I wouldn't say that it is about to crash, but Putin's grip on power is shakier than it was 2 years earlier. So many Russians are wondering, what if Putin loses power, is removed from office, or is even assassinated? Somebody will replace him, and the personality of the successor will be extremely important, because Russian politics is not about institutions, it is about personalities. In Russia, the very same political system could be a totalitarian dictatorship as it was under Stalin, or a relatively mild authoritarian country as it was under Khrushchev several years later. So, who are the people most often speculated about as potential successors? The first candidate is Mikhail Mishustin. He's the prime minister, the head of the government, and the number 2 man in Russia's official political hierarchy. In the Russian political system, the prime minister is not a politician. They are a technocrat who can wield great power because they directly operate Russian state economics. Mishustin has a reputation for being a technocrat, a professional operator without a well-defined political orientation. He started in the early 1990s as a businessman who sold computers and then made a career in the treasury. He is the creator of the current Russian fiscal system, which is relatively modern and agile. Without a doubt, he is corrupt as any of Putin's officials, and Russian investigative journalists have published a lot of information about shady businesses connected to his allies. But at the same time, he has a reputation for being a competent and practical administrator. Mishustin is not involved in the war directly. He rarely comments on war-related issues and keeps his distance from fascist-style rallies and other pro-war events. This may be important if he is to replace Putin and have to deal with Western leaders on the subject of lifting sanctions. He won't have blood on his hands. According to the Russian constitution, the Prime Minister assumes the role of temporary president for 3 months if the president dies or can no longer perform his duties. There is no guarantee that, if Putin dies, the constitutional order will behave any influence on events, but formally speaking, Mishustin is first in the official line of succession. The second figure of interest is Sergey Sobyanin. Sobyanin is the mayor of Moscow and is, of course, totally dependent on Putin, but definitely has some political ambitions of his own. Using federal petrodollars, Sobyanin has turned Moscow into a European-style city with good infrastructure, modern urban solutions and high quality of life for the people who live there. This is not because of his managerial talents, but because in Russia we have a serious imbalance between the capital city and the regions. Russian regions like the Tula or Kirov get very little, while Moscow gets everything. And this is politically important because revolutions are usually made in capitals, not in provincial towns. So, for Putin, Sobyanin is a man who provides great benefits to Moscow residents and effectively buys their loyalty to the Kremlin. But this situation has, in effect, given him a reputation for being a good administrator. Before becoming mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin worked in Siberia. He has tight connections with regional elites and the heads of the oil and gas industry. In a way, he is a Soviet self-made man. He was born in the family of a director of a small factory in Siberia, worked in another factory himself, and then joined the Communist Party and made a career inside it. He even has experience winning relatively fair elections dating from the early 2000s. The mayor of the capital is always a possible candidate for the presidency, and like Mishustin, Sobyanin is not directly associated with the war, so he could be a convenient counterpart for the West in a post-war era. In contrast, another potential successor, Sergey Shoigu, is directly connected with the war. He is the Minister of Defense, so he is responsible for the war almost as much as Putin. But we can put him on the list of possible successors because of his political weight and proximity to Putin. Furthermore, Shoigu controls the Russian army, and during wartime, this makes him one of the most important figures in the Russian political elite. Shoigu is not a professional soldier. Before becoming Minister of Defense, he was the head of the Ministry of Emergency, something like the United States FEMA, and was pretty popular among Russians. He's close to Putin and depends on him, but he came to politics before Putin during Yeltsin's time, and this makes him a slightly more independent. For me, it's difficult to imagine Shoigu emerging as Putin's successor now, but who knows? As we already know, a military coup is not an unrealistic scenario for today's Russia. Another candidate is ex-president Dmitry Medvedev, who was Putin's placeholder president from 2008 to 2012. After that he was the prime minister, but in 2020 Putin demoted him to the position of deputy chairman of the Security Council. This is an honorary position without real impact or influence, and it was interpreted as a sign that Medvedev had fallen into disgrace. But after the war started, Medvedev started making aggressive and provocative statements about the West. This was a ridiculous turn for Medvedev, because he had a reputation as a pro-Western liberal, had a good relationship with President Obama, and met with Steve Jobs personally. But now he has done a 180 and often threatens the United States and Europe with nuclear annihilation and calls Western countries lion beasts. Putin recently gave him a new post in the Military Industrial Commission, and Medvedev is now responsible for the production of military equipment and ammunition. Many political experts think that he still has a chance to be Putin's successor once more, because he already proved his loyalty in 2012 when he meekly agreed to return the presidential chair to Putin. A lesser-known challenger is Dmitry Patrushev, Russian Minister of Agriculture. It is not his job title that is important, but his lineage. He is the son of Mikhail Patrushev, one of Putin's closest allies. Patrushev Sr. used to be the head of the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB, and now he is the secretary of the Security Council, a consultative body of intelligence chiefs around Putin. He is considered to be the most powerful member of the political group called Siloviki, something like strongman. Dmitry Patrushev is young. He is just 45 years old. He has worked in banks close to the government and graduated from the FSB Academy. He is unknown among ordinary Russians, but just as Putin appeared from nowhere in 1999, Patrushev could emerge on the political scene at the right moment. If so, he would be just a puppet of his father and other Siloviki. One more candidate is Alexey Dyumin. He is the governor of Tula region, which is close to Moscow. He began his career as Putin's bodyguard and then played an important role in the annexation of Crimea in 2014. As far as I know, he is not very intelligent or talented and is on the list of possible successor just because of his boundless loyalty to Putin. These are the allies of Putin who can nurture hope that one day he'll decide to hand the reins of power to them. But there are also several figures who could take power without Putin's consent. Before the recent rebellion in Russia, some considered Yevgeniy Prigozhin a possible successor to Putin. Undoubtedly, he has political ambitions and behaves much more brightly than most politicians in modern Russia. It's clear that Putin wouldn't have entrusted him with the throne, and after the rebellion, Prigozhin turned into an outcast. But we shouldn't write him off. The private army Wagner is still under his command and can still play a role in changing power in Russia. By the way, I have a separate video about Prigozhin. The link will be on your screen. There is also speculation about Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya. It's important to understand that Chechnya is like a small Middle East-style dictatorship inside Russia, with a cult of personality around Kadyrov, the absence of rule of law, and fantastic levels of corruption. In Chechnya, Kadyrov behaves like a middle-aged tyrant. He is not popular in other regions of Russia, but just like Prigozhin, he has his own army. But my guess is that in a critical moment, he will use it not to capture power in Russia, but to separate Chechnya and other regions of Caucasus from Russia and become independent. You might ask, are there any good guys in Russian politics who could take Putin's place? Over the last few years, Putin has tried to eliminate any popular figures from the political stage. There is no longer any legal opposition left in Russia, but I could name two democratic politicians who could succeed Putin as Russia's president. The first is Alexey Navalny, who is currently in prison, but his allies continue to work inside and outside Russia. Navalny stands for democratic change and an end to the war with Ukraine. Another candidate is the ex-oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who lives abroad now and attempts to consolidate Russian opposition groups in the West. He declares himself a Democrat as well, and he could be a suitable compromise figure for the Russian elite, which remembers him as a successful businessman in the 1990s. In the end, it's unlikely that Putin will choose some successor and step down. Even if he wanted to, he can see unsuccessful examples of such attempted transfers of power in other post-Soviet countries. The most recent was in Kazakhstan, where the old autocrat Nursultan Nazarbayev left the president's post to his acolyte Kasym-Jomart Tokayev. Nazarbayev hoped to keep his hold on power by taking on the role of national leader, kind of a political patriarch. But Tokayev didn't want to be a puppet and soon ousted Nazarbayev and his relatives. Putin understands that this is not a way for him to end his years in a peaceful security. So I think Putin hopes to sit in the Kremlin until the very end. But a lot depends on whether or not the end comes unexpectedly. Will Putin have time to plan his departure or not? Almost certainly he's preparing his own surprises. It could be appointing an unexpected successor or something very exotic up to a coronation and inheritance of the throne. Of course, this is a very unlikely scenario, but who knows? It's more likely that after Putin, we will get something like collective rule, as it was after Stalin's death. Stalin's allies decided to moderate the political regime in the Soviet Union and tried to establish a group of rulers. But as I said before, Russian political culture is more about personalities, so it will almost certainly return to being a system with a sole leader. The best option for Russia would be to rebuild democratic institutions and to conduct fair elections. I am absolutely sure that many worthy people would take part in this rebuilding process, from Alexey Navalny to the regional politician Yevgeniy Prigozhin, who is quite popular among many different social groups. I think the best scenario is for Russia to turn into a parliamentary republic where the president's role is not so important, but this would contradict Russian political traditions and it wouldn't necessarily prevent the country from falling into a new dictatorship. There is another scenario we haven't discussed yet. What if Russia collapses or falls apart and ceases to exist? I'll talk about that possibility in one of my upcoming videos. Please feel free to write a comment about how you see the political future of Russia. Also subscribe to this channel and tap the like button to support this video and this channel. If you want to support my efforts to bring timely, accurate information about what's happening in Russia from the perspective of an independent journalist, consider supporting me on Patreon. The link is below. Take care.